My name is Elena, and I am an English teacher. I love my job very much because teaching is something I care about deeply. But there is a problem that I see every day in my classroom. My students read English well and they write English too. But when it comes to speaking, something stops them. They look scared. They say, "I don't know how." It is like they forget everything when they want to talk. This makes me sad and frustrated because I know they have worked very hard to learn English. Every day, I watch the same thing happen. A student tries to answer a question in English, but then switches to Spanish because they feel nervous or unsure. Another student hears a question and understands it, but cannot say anything back in English. It is hard to see this because I want them to use the language, not just study it. I ask myself, why do they know so many words and grammar but cannot speak? This question stays in my mind all the time. One day, I was sitting in the teacher's lounge with my coffee when my colleague, Mr. Lish, joined me. He looked tired. I asked him, "What is wrong?" He sighed and said, "My students don't speak English. They only memorize words." I nodded because I feel the same way. We both want our students to speak, but the school's way of teaching is not helping. I said, "We need to change the way we teach." Louise laughed and said, "The director will never allow that." She was right. Our school has strict rules. Students must use books with long lists of words and do many grammar exercises. Speaking practice is not part of the lessons. The director watches closely, and teachers must follow the program exactly. That night, I could not sleep. My mind was full of questions and worries. Why do my students learn grammar but not how to speak? Why can they say many words but cannot order a coffee in English? I felt I had to try something different, but I did not know how. I sat up in bed and decided I had to try. The next morning, I walked into the classroom with a new plan. I smiled and said, "Today, no books." The students looked surprised and confused. A girl asked, "No books." I shook my head and said, "No books today. We will talk." I wrote "at the airport" on the board. The students looked at each other, unsure what to do. I explained, "You are at an airport. You need to ask for your ticket, go through security, and find your gate. Let's practice." A boy named Carlos raised his hand nervously and said, "Teacher, we don't know the words." I smiled and said, "Then let's learn them together." I said, "Repeat after me." "Excuse me, where is my gate?" The class repeated slowly. At first they were shy, but then their voices got louder. For the first time they were speaking English, not reading or writing. Suddenly the door opened. The director stood there watching. My heart beat fast. He crossed his arms and asked, "What are you doing, Elena?" I tried to stay calm and said, "I am teaching English." He frowned and said, "This is not in the book." The students went quiet and looked at me. I felt nervous, but I took a deep breath. The director asked again, "Where is the book?" My hands were shaking. I said, "Today we are practicing conversation." He looked at the board and said, "This is not in the curriculum." I tried to explain that the students need to speak English in real situations. They can memorize words but cannot talk. The director shook his head and said, "The school has rules. Follow the book." I heard a small voice. It was Anna, the shyest girl in class. She said, "We like this teacher." The director sighed and said, "Elena, come to my office after class." Then he left the room and the door closed. The students looked worried. They asked, "Teacher, are you in trouble?" I smiled and said, "No, don't worry. Let's continue." We practiced more. "Excuse me, where is my gate?" Their voices grew stronger. I felt hope, but also fear. The bell rang and class was over. I took a deep breath and walked to the director's office. Inside, he sat behind his desk and said, "Elena, I understand your passion, but this school has rules. We use books and follow the program." I nodded, but inside I wanted to scream. He said, "It is not your decision." I looked at him, my heart beating fast. I said, "I cannot teach like this. It does not work. My students are learning more today than in the last 3 months." He looked at me for a long moment, then leaned back and said, "You are taking a big risk." I nodded and said, "I know." He tapped his fingers on the desk and warned, "If you continue, there may be consequences." I held my breath. He did not say more, but then stood up and said, "Go home, Elena. Think about what you were doing." I walked to the door with weak legs. Before I left, I looked at him and thought, I already know my answer. He did not respond. My heart was racing and my mind was spinning. What would happen next? The next morning, I walked into my classroom feeling nervous but also excited. My hands were shaking a little because I did not know if the director was watching. What if I lost my job? But when I looked at my students, their eyes were bright and full of hope. Anna smiled at me and said, "Teacher, today we practice again." No one was standing by the door, no director in sight. I took a deep breath and said, "Yes, today we practice again." I wrote on the board, "At the hotel." The students whispered and smiled. They were excited. I turned to Carlos and said, "You are a tourist. You arrive at a hotel. You need a room." Carlos stood up nervously and said, hello. I need a room." I nodded and said, "Good. Now let's learn some new words together." We practiced the sentence slowly with the whole class repeating after me. His voice grew stronger every time. "Hello, I need a room," Carlos said confidently. The class clapped and I felt happy. For the first time, I saw my students really using English. Then I gave them a listening exercise. I played a short conversation of a hotel check-in on the audio. The students listened carefully. When the audio paused, I asked, "What did the receptionist say?" Anna raised her hand and said, "Do you have a reservation?" I smiled and said, "Yes." "Very good." Next, I handed out short dialogues for reading aloud. 2 students stood and read their parts. Their voices were shaky at first, but got better with each sentence. Then I introduced a rule for the day. From now on, only English. No Spanish allowed. The students looked nervous, but Anna smiled and said, "Okay, teacher." She turned to Carlos and said, "Hello, do you have a reservation?" Carlos hesitated, then took a deep breath and said, "Yes, for 3 nights." The class clapped again, and I felt a rush of joy. Just then, the door opened. I froze, but it was not the director. It was Luis, my colleague. He looked around the classroom frowning. "Elena, what are you doing?" he asked. I swallowed and said, "Teaching English." He stepped closer and said, "You are not using the book." I crossed my arms and said, "No, I'm not." The students watched us waiting. Luis shook his head and said, "You are brave, Elena, but this is dangerous." I lowered my voice and said, "Look, they are learning. They want to speak. They are not afraid anymore." Luis looked around the room and saw the students' excitement. After a long sigh, he said something I did not expect. "Okay, let me try the class." The students gasped, and I blinked in surprise. Luis smiled and said, "I want to see if your method works." He turned to Carlos and said, "I am the hotel receptionist." "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" Carlos's eyes got wide. Then he took a deep breath and said, "Hello, I need a room." Louise nodded and asked, "For how many nights?" Carlos looked at me, I whispered. 3 nights. Carlos turned back and said, 3 nights. Louise grinned. Very good. The students cheered and my heart raced. Louise was helping me. Maybe I was not alone. But then the classroom door opened again. This time it was the director. He stood there and looked at Louise, then at me, then at the students. No one moved. He stepped inside, looked at the board that said "at the hotel" and asked, "What is this?" Silence filled the room. Anna, the shy girl, raised her hand and stood up. Her voice was small but clear. "This is English, sir." The room felt frozen. The director's face did not change. He looked at me and said, "Come to my office now." My stomach dropped. What would happen next? I gathered my things, and as I walked out, Anna touched my arm and said softly, "Teacher, I want to learn like this. Please don't stop." I smiled, but inside I was scared. In the director's office, he sat behind his desk. His voice was calm but tense as he said, "Elena, I told you to follow the book." I took a deep breath and said, "Sir, the book is not enough. The students need to speak English. They need real situations." He leaned back and asked, "You think your way is better?" I hesitated, then nodded. The director sighed and said, "Do you know how many teachers have tried to change the system? Do you know what happened to them?" I shook my head, afraid of the answer. "They are no longer here," he said quietly. A cold feeling spread in my chest. Was he saying I would lose my job? Before I could speak, there was a knock on the door. The director frowned and said, "Come in." Louise walked in looking serious. "Sir, I need to say something," he said. The director raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Louise told the director that he had been in my class today and saw something important. He said the students were speaking English, not just reading or memorizing, but speaking. They were confident and learning in a way I have never seen before. The director looked at Louise, then at me. Louise nodded. "So now I am part of this too," he said. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the director stood up and walked to the window, hands behind his back. He said slowly, "This school has followed the same method for years. We have rules for a reason." He turned around and looked at us again. But I cannot ignore results. My breath caught in my throat. He sat back at his desk and said, "I will observe one more class. If I see real progress, I will think about it. If not, you will go back to the book." My hands trembled. This was my chance, but also my test. The next morning, I stood in front of my class, with my hands cold and my heart racing. Today was very important. The director was going to watch us. If I failed, I might lose the chance to keep teaching my way. I glanced at the door, and there he was standing with his arms crossed. Mr. Lish was next to him. The students looked at me waiting. I forced a smile and said, "Good morning, class." They answered louder than usual, "Good morning, teacher." They knew today was special. I wrote on the board. At the restaurant, the students whispered and laughed quietly. They were excited. I told them, "Today you will go to a restaurant. You will order food and ask for the check. You will speak English." Carlos raised his hand nervously and asked, "Teacher, what if we make mistakes?" I smiled warmly and said, "Mistakes are good. Mistakes help us learn." I set up the activity. Anna was the waitress and Carlos was the customer. The class watched as they began. Anna said, "Hello, welcome. Can I take your order?" Carlos hesitated and looked nervous. I held my breath and hoped he would try. Then Carlos swallowed hard and said, "Yes, I want a hamburger and orange juice." The class clapped and I heard a small laugh. I turned my head and saw the director smiling. Then something surprising happened. The director stepped forward and sat down on a chair. He cleared his throat and said, "Excuse me, waitress. Can I see the menu?" The room was silent. The students stared at him with wide eyes. Was this real? Was he playing the game? Anna blinked and looked at me. I nodded and she took a deep breath. "Yes, sir. Here is the menu." The director pretended to read the menu and said, "What do you recommend?" Anna looked at the board, searching for words. Then she smiled and said, "The pizza is very good." The students gasped. Anna was speaking English to the director. He nodded and said, "Okay, I will have the pizza and a soda." Anna wrote it down and asked 1 pizza and 1 soda. "Anything else?" The director shook his head and said, "That's all, thank you." The students whispered excitedly, and I held my breath. Then the director stood up and looked at me. My heart stopped. "Elena, come to my office," he said. I swallowed and nodded. I felt every student watching me as I left. Louise gave me a small nod. I followed the director down the hall. My mind was spinning. Was the class good or bad? What would he say? In his office, he closed the door and sat at his desk. Is this the end? Will you fire me? I wondered. The director leaned forward and said slowly, "Elena, do you know how long I have worked at this school?" I shook my head. 25 years, he said. For 25 years, we have used the same method. Books, grammar exercises, vocabulary lists. But for 25 years, students have left this school unable to speak English. My heart skipped a beat. Today, I saw something different, he continued. I saw students speaking. I saw confidence. I saw learning. I held my breath. I am not an easy man to convince, but today you convinced me. I blinked. Did I hear right? He nodded. Your method works. The students were engaged. They were thinking. They were using the language, not just memorizing it. A rush of relief filled my chest. I could hardly believe it. But then his face became serious again. He raised a finger and said, "This does not mean you can do whatever you want. You must have structure. You must have a plan." I nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. I will prepare activities. I will make sure the students learn all the important vocabulary and grammar." He was silent for a moment, then nodded and said, "All right. You have my permission to continue." I felt like I could finally breathe. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you so much." He waved a hand and said, "Don't thank me yet. This is an experiment. If the students improve, we will talk about changing the method for all classes. If not, you go back to the book." I smiled and promised they will improve, sir. "I promise." He watched me for a moment, then nodded. "Go back to class, Elena. Do your job." I left his office with my heart racing, but not from fear. This time, it was from excitement. As I walked back to my classroom, I saw Mr. Lish waiting in the hallway. He raised an eyebrow. I grinned. We did it. Louise let out a breath and smiled. "Seriously?" I nodded seriously. He shook his head and smiled. I pushed open the classroom door. The students jumped up and said, "Teacher, what happened?" I laughed and said we won. They cheered. Anna clapped her hands and Carlos pumped his fist in the air. I walked to the board and wrote 2 big words. "Let's talk." I turned to the class and said, "All right, today we go to the airport." They laughed and looked excited. They were ready. For the first time, I knew my students were really learning English. After class, I sat at my desk and took a deep breath. Today was a victory, but it was not just my victory, it was theirs. I thought about Anna, who was too shy to speak before, but now ordered food in English. I thought about Carlos, who once said, "I don't know how," but now spoke with confidence. I thought about Louise, who had doubted me at first, but became my biggest supporter. And I thought about myself. I was afraid. I almost gave up. I almost followed the rules, even when I knew they were wrong. But learning is not about fear. It is not about rules. It is about using the language, making mistakes, and trying again. Teaching is not about books. Teaching is about opening doors. Today, I opened a door for my students. Now they are ready to walk through it. The next day, I walked into my classroom feeling both nervous and hopeful. The director had said he would watch one more class before deciding if I could continue teaching my way. My students were waiting, their faces full of excitement and trust. I smiled and wrote on the board, "At the park." Today's lesson was about meeting new people and talking about simple things like the weather or what you like to do. I wanted to show the director how much my students had grown. I began by asking the class, "What do you say when you meet someone for the first time?" A few students whispered, "Hello" or "How are you?" I nodded and said, "Good. Now let's practice." We did role plays where one student met another, asked questions, and answered back. At first, they were shy, but then their voices grew louder and more confident. Halfway through the class, the door opened quietly. The director stepped inside and sat at the back. I could feel his eyes watching me, but I kept my focus on the students. I was proud to see how much they spoke and how happy they looked. The class felt alive, and the students were not afraid to make mistakes. After the role plays, I gave them a short reading exercise about a picnic. We read together, and I helped with difficult words. Then I asked questions about the story. The students answered in full sentences, practicing both grammar and speaking. The director's expression was serious but calm. At the end of the class, I asked the students to share what they had learned. Anna said, "I can talk to people now." Carlos said, "I am not afraid to speak." The room was filled with smiles and pride. I turned to the director and said quietly, "Thank you for watching." After the students left, the director called me to his office. My heart beat fast. I wondered what he would say. He sat behind his desk and looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled slightly and said, "Elena, I saw real progress today. The students spoke English. They were confident." I nodded and said, "Yes, sir. They are working hard." He leaned back in his chair and said, "This is not easy for me. Our school has always followed strict rules, but I cannot ignore results." He paused and then added, "I will allow you to continue your method for now, but you must keep records of the students' progress. We need proof that this works." I promised him I would. Inside, I felt a rush of happiness and relief. I knew this was just the beginning, but it was a big step. The director stood up and said, "Keep working hard, Elena. Your students are lucky to have you." That afternoon, I shared the good news with my students. They cheered and thanked me. I told them, "You are doing great. Keep speaking English. Keep making mistakes. That is how we learn." Their smiles were my greatest reward. From that day, I felt more confident as a teacher. I knew that change was possible, even in a school with many rules. My students were not just memorizing words anymore. They were using English in real life. That made all the difference. I also learned something important. Teaching is not just about following rules or books. It is about listening to students' needs, encouraging them, and helping them believe in themselves. Every student has value and meaning. They do not need to do big things to be important. They just need someone to open a door for them. As I walked home that day, I thought about Anna and Carlos. They had come so far. They had found their voices. I felt proud of them, and I felt proud of myself for not giving up. Teaching is a journey, and every step matters. I woke up the next morning feeling hopeful, but a little nervous. Today, I would teach my class again with the director watching. I knew this was my last chance to prove that my way of teaching could work. As I walked into the classroom, the students greeted me with big smiles and bright eyes. They were ready to learn and speak English. I wrote on the board, "At the store." Today's lesson was about shopping and asking for help. I explained to the students, "You are at a store. You want to buy something? You need to ask questions and say what you want." The students whispered excitedly and prepared for the role play. Carlos was the customer, and Anna was the shop assistant. I helped them practice the sentences slowly. "Can I help you?" "Yes, I want to buy a shirt." At first, their voices were soft, but with practice, they grew louder and more confident. The other students watched and clapped for them. The director was sitting quietly at the back, watching closely. I could see that he was interested and paying attention to every word. After the role play, I asked the class questions to check their understanding. They answered clearly and smiled proudly. At the end of the lesson, the director stood up and walked to the front of the class. Everyone went quiet, unsure of what he would say. He smiled and said, "Elena, I am impressed. The students are speaking English. They are confident." The class cheered, and I felt tears of happiness. Later, the director invited me to his office. He told me that he had seen something special in my class. He admitted that the old method had not helped students speak English, and that my way showed real progress. He said he would support me to continue teaching like this, but with a clear plan and goals. I promised to prepare lessons that helped students learn grammar vocabulary and, most importantly, how to speak English. The director smiled and said, "This is just the beginning, Elena. Together we can help students open the door to English." Walking back to my classroom, I felt proud and hopeful. I thought about Anna, who was once too shy to speak, but now talked with confidence. I thought about Carlos, who believed he could not speak English, but now used it every day. I thought about myself, how I almost gave up, but kept trying because I believed in my students. Teaching is not just about books or rules. It is about helping students find their voices, make mistakes, and try again. Every person has value and meaning in life. You do not need to do big things to be important. Even small steps like learning to speak a new language can open doors to a better future. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to BTM English Story. Together we can open more doors and help more students speak with confidence. Remember, your voice matters.